big long neck. It was a bad. Call it into order. Yes. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Public Health and Safety meeting for June the 15th. The first order of business is to call it to order and welcome you. And the second order of business is to appoint a chair. Is there any nominees?
Yep, I nominate Sylvia Ortiz.
Second.
Okay. All those in favor, raise your right hand. So be it. I think they just like it because I can just speed things up and get through it. Nothing personal there. Second order of business is approval of the minutes from September the 28th. I don't know if you guys have had a chance to read them. I'll take a motion from the floor. I have read them.
Motion to approve.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Second. All those in favor, raise your right hand. 3-0. Thank you. Next, I'd like to do this. This is kind of out of the ordinary, but I do this. I'd like to introduce everybody at the table, starting with Brenda, so we all know who's here. And there's a sign-up sheet in the back. If you have not had a chance to sign up, please do so before you leave. That way we have your contact information. Okay, Brenda?
Brenda Younger, City Clerk.
Luther Gagne, I'm the legal advisor for the police department.
Mike Padilla, District 5.
Sandra Clear, District 2.
Lisa Robertson, City Attorney.
Thank you. Also join us is the city manager, Mr. Trout, City Council Member Lesser, and I know your face and I forgot your name.
Sergeant Clam, Chief of Police.
Okay. And H&D, Sasha Hahn. H&D, I still say H&D, it's Neighborhood Relations. That's how old I am. Corey Wright, and your name, sir?
Mike Foster.
Mike Foster from the Topeka. Okay. And then we have WIBW. I guess it's too hot to be in the garden today, huh? Okay. Number 4, camping on public and private property. What I'd like to do is I would like to start out with staff, if they would like to kind of give us a little background on that. And I'm going to tell you guys right now, this is probably going to be a and B meeting. I don't think we're going to be able to get it done in this meeting, but we'll have to come back again. Yes.
I think I left mine in the car. Do we have copies of the ordinance?
I thought.
Sasha.
I'm sorry, I forgot one.
4.
Sasha, thank you. Okay, but if, Lisa, if you would like to go ahead, and City Attorney, if you go ahead and kind of brief us a little bit on where this all came about and where we're going with this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Uh-huh.
We have a couple of ordinances that we had presented to the body not too long ago. One was a pedestrian safety ordinance. The other was a camping ordinance. The camping ordinance was referred to this committee for further review. The pedestrian safety ordinance was referred to a special committee that was appointed by the deputy mayor, and they are working independently of this group. Luther Gagne, who's the police legal advisor, has done a lot of background research and work on this matter. I think all of you have a PowerPoint slide packet that he's put together, and he has that available to go through this evening or this afternoon if you all would like to do that.
Absolutely.
I think what we were hoping to do was maybe get your thoughts on what you think is important to include or not in this ordinance, and then maybe after that, kind of going through the ordinance itself, if that makes sense to you guys? Okay. So if you'd like Luther to load that presentation up and kind of go through it and have a discussion.
Will it be on the screen? Absolutely. Yeah, let's do that next. Are you done, Lisa?
Yep,
Okay,
absolutely.
that'll be
Thank
our
you.
next, let me move, and that'll be our next order of business. I can see. Yeah, I just couldn't. Everybody
camping ordinance that's before the committee. Does it-
Luther, make sure you're on a mic so our TV audience can hear us, please. Thank you.
The camping ordinance that is before the committee,
I don't think it's on.
Is it on?
Okay. Okay.
the camping ordinance that's in front of the committee this afternoon for consideration does a couple of things. It is primarily an enforcement ordinance addressing issues of people camping on public property or private property without written permission of the landowner. There's some definitions involved in that and some other regulations involved, but just basically overall what it does is it concerns the issue of camping on public property or private property. It also has a second piece to it regarding storage of property, a person's belongings that they may have with them at that campsite, what can be done with that. What I've prepared for you this afternoon, you may notice it says homeless outreach team, and you may be wondering what that has to do with a camping ordinance. They're actually very closely related because it's legally very difficult to do one without the other. And as I go through this, I'll explain why that is. Just for some background, these are some fairly recent pictures that have been taken around our city, just kind of looking at what the problem is. This was a individual that was camping under the bridge over across the river into North Topeka. He had a number of items up under the bridge, including some furniture. Don't do that. Here we have issues of campsites being set up on public right-of-ways, public property, large collection of items. This was a campsite that was down along the Kansas River. Same with this. This photograph was actually taken by code enforcement. They'd gone in and cleaned this site up after it was abandoned. And these are all things that the property that people leave behind. Again, this is along the Kansas River. There's a fair amount of effort that was put into establishing this campsite. What this is, in trying to look at just how big the problem is, this is the national point in time count. In 2017, they estimated there was just over a little over 500,000 people in the country experiencing homelessness, and approximately a third of those were unsheltered. If we're looking at people that were camping outdoors, sleeping on public property or on private property, that 1/3 would be the group that you would be looking at. Here locally, this is the 2018 point in time count. For us, we had an increase in homelessness from 2017 to 2018. Went from 356 to 419. Here locally, about 15% of our homeless population is unsheltered. You do the math, that equates to roughly 62 people that are potentially sleeping unsheltered outdoors. Part of the difficulty with this topic, whenever you look at what to do, is just the complexity of it. You've got potentially multiple city departments involved, whether it's police, fire, code enforcement, neighborhood relations. You've also got other departments, the city manager, the city council, that are affected by the complaints that are received from citizens concerning what's going on. The municipal code limitation. What I'm talking about there is we really have no framework in our city code when it comes to camping in public. When we have a situation like that comes up, there's a lot of times the inclination is to call the police, and unless the person is trespassing on private property, there's very little the police can do because we do not have any type of camping regulations. Social service organizations. Topeka has a lot of social services. It's actually kind of overwhelming if you were to sit down and try to make a list of all the services that were out there. And policy groups, homeless rights, ACLU, even things like what we've seen locally with Poor People's Campaign and different advocacy groups. Neighborhood relations, business groups, people complaining, making complaints, the impact on their businesses, the impact on crime stats, sometimes that we see with some of this stuff with thefts and littering and drug use. And then the other concern under that category would be with like tourism and events and stuff like that. You have a homeless camp under the bridge right next to where you're trying to have some kind of event. That also generates some concerns. The point of all of that is it's a very complex issue because you've got all of these different directions and competing interests. Now, I mentioned services, resources. This is by no means a complete list. This is only a couple. I am not an expert on the services that are out there, but there's a lot of them. And as far as what I have found in working on this project is that's part of the complexity, is just trying to understand the sheer number of things out there to assist people that are homeless. So when I began, I said that the camping ordinance is an enforcement component, and that is really true, but there are some limitations on what we can do with that. And to begin kind of the discussion about that is we have to understand that there's this kind of balancing between a person's ability to comply and their willingness to comply. The reason for that is it is not constitutional. It's not something we can't criminalize the act of just being homeless. People that are homeless, they may have no choice but to sleep in public. If they can't sleep there, where can they sleep? So when you say ability to comply, that's what it's talking about, is does the person have any other option? Is there someplace else they can go? The ability to comply is where we have difficulty imposing regulations and making it illegal to camp. The other side of that equation is the willingness to comply. And that's where the rest of this discussion, and I'm going to be talking about that piece of it, is the willingness to comply is what would a city need to do before they could start to enforce anti-camping regulations. So legal concerns, we've got a couple. Constitutional concerns would be with the Eighth Amendment and the fundamental right to travel. You look at litigation involving these types of issues, and typically these are the kinds of arguments that you see raised by plaintiffs in cases like this, that punishing somebody for sleeping in public when they have no other place to sleep, or typically what you see with the right to travel is a city using law enforcement to make people leave or disperse, leave their campsite, stuff like that, and prohibit them in certain areas. And that's been interpreted as an interference with the constitutional right to travel. This is a quote from a Department of Justice brief that was filed in a fairly significant case up in Idaho, Bell versus City of Boise. And what they're doing is they're recognizing the Eighth Amendment argument about cruel and unusual punishment for penalizing somebody that has no other option but to sleep in public. That is a recognized violation of the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, because they don't have any options. So, how do we get options? We spent a lot of time looking at this case. This is a landmark class action lawsuit case that came out of Florida, the city of Miami. It goes back to 1992, but the settlement agreement that is in place in this case is still in effect today. And I said this is a landmark case because one of the things this case did was establish these things called Pottinger Protocols. And it's useful to look at this case because this is what identifies what a city needs to do if we're going to have an enforcement component in our ordinances. So, looking at the settlement, one of the things it did is it laid out kind of the rules that the city would need to follow. It does it by defining what a homeless person is, requires documentation whenever the government has contact with a homeless person, documenting our outreach efforts, whether that's just simply informational, offering the person a ride to the shelter, that person's response to the offer of a shelter bed. And typically that would be done by a police officer through the use of a field information card or an incident report or something of that nature. But there's some documentation that's going on about the city's effort to move that person from sleeping in public and steer them towards acceptance of some kind of service. Another important piece of this, not only documenting, but where those records are kept. And the police department keeping those records puts them in a position to have access to the information if down the road you do get to the enforcement piece and there is a citation or an arrest made. Then when that case goes to court, the police department is in the best position to have those records of what efforts were made by the city prior to taking enforcement action. The Pottinger case also defined this thing called life-sustaining conduct misdemeanors, and it's a recognition that some of this activity that is going on, such as eating, sleeping, sitting, congregating, walking in public, that's just part of being a person. People need shelter, they need food. The importance of identifying this is when you have something like a camping ordinance that's going to infringe on these types of activities, then the government is going to have the burden in order to justify why that enforcement is necessary in respects to the Eighth Amendment. The Pottinger case also defined what is an available shelter, and there's some certain qualifications that we have to meet in order to consider a shelter bed as being available. It needs to be something that's available 24 hours, any time of the day, actually a regular bed or a mat, no cost, within the city, somewhere where we could actually transport the person to or they could get themselves there. And it has to be free of any type of mandatory religious or therapeutic program. If we can do that, then if the shelter bed that is potentially going to be used can satisfy all of those categories, then we can count that as an available shelter. And if it's an available shelter bed, that becomes important because then it's going to be on the individual to either accept or refuse our offer of that bed. If it is an available bed, then you get the discussion between are they able to comply or willing to comply. So, available shelter, if there is no bed available, there's no enforcement of the ordinance. You see that built into the ordinance, the draft ordinance that you have in front of you. There's a restriction on when we can enforce it. That piece of our ordinance comes directly from these protocols. If there is an available shelter and the homeless person accepts it, then there's also no enforcement. They go to the shelter and they go on their way. It's only when there is an available shelter bed and there is a refusal to accept it is when we would have application of the ordinance and a potential enforcement action by a police officer. Number 7 in the protocols is establishing protection for the person's property. And you also, this is the second piece of the ordinance that you have in front of you. Again, this comes from these protocols established by the Pottinger case, is what happens to the person's property? Well, the government can't just come along and take it and seize it and throw it in the trash. We have to give the person notice. If they don't take it, the government can come and impound it, but they have to store it for a while and give the person an opportunity to claim their property. This involves giving them notice that we've done this, where it's located, and how they can reclaim their property. Our ordinance that you've got in front of you requires that the police hold it for a period of 90 days. If it's not claimed after that period of time, then it would become abandoned and disposed of. The Pottinger case also required training of law enforcement personnel when it comes to the issue of dealing with homeless people, that recognizing that the issues with being homeless were kind of unique. And it's not something that the police may have ordinary, everyday experience with. So this case established a training requirement that the police that are working with the homeless people, they need to receive some training in how to go about doing this. That training requirement has led to the development of what we call HOT teams, homeless outreach teams. And there are multiple organizations in the city offering services that have an outreach team. The Topeka Police Department, though, does not. And it's really critical that they develop an outreach team, because the police are the collection point for all of this information on the outreach efforts that we've made and what services have been offered to the person, and are they accepting or are they refusing. So you need that police officer, that homeless outreach team affiliated with your law enforcement agency in the center of this as kind of the coordinating collection point for the information. A couple of things that this case does not say. If there is a felony or a misdemeanor for any other type of crime, nothing in this case precludes the police from making an arrest in that. This is limited to issues like camping and other life-sustaining conduct. And this Pottinger case also does not say how many shelter beds you have available. At the beginning of this, there was a slide that I had on there that we had 62, roughly, according to our point in time count. Nothing in this has ever said that we have to have 62 available beds. It's just, before you can enforce it, you have to have a bed offered to that person. If you don't have a bed, then you can't enforce it. It also never said anything about who has to own or operate those, whether it's publicly owned or privately owned and operated. There's no restriction on that. The only thing they said is that bed that is offered, in order to be an available bed, it has to be free of the religious and therapeutic, the mandatory requirements for that as a condition of them being in that bed. There was a report done in June of 2012 by the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. And what this report looked at was looking for solutions on how to avoid criminalizing homelessness. And it's a fairly lengthy report, but condensing it and summarizing it, There were three main recommendations come out of that. For purposes of today, the second recommendation is the one that is probably most relevant to our discussion this afternoon. It's the collaboration between law enforcement and behavioral health and social service providers. And what they did when they looked at that is they recognized the importance of having the law enforcement involved in that. Just the link to document and monitor that the services are getting to the people that need them before any kind of enforcement action is taken. Because where cities tend to get in trouble is when they are not documenting this and they've made an arrest and they go to court and they have no background history on how they got there. They just simply arrested somebody. And maybe they talked to them before, maybe they offered them services, but nobody really knows that because the police officer is the one in the court testifying. Cross-training of police officers and service providers. This is the specialization of the mission, recognizing that this kind of a police officer, this kind of work is going to be pretty specialized, and they need to have close relationships with the service providers. Then the report itself, it actually talks about crisis intervention teams. We have that already in our police department. So what's a HOT team look like? A homeless outreach team. In preparing this ordinance, preparing this presentation, we've looked at a number of cities. Obviously Miami, because that's where this case originated from. The Pottinger case was the city of Miami. We also looked at the city of Sarasota, Florida. In 2006, the city of Sarasota was named as the meanest city in America when it came to dealing with homeless issues. And by following this, in large part, they've been able to reverse that. And now they are considered a very humane city. We looked at the city of Colorado Springs. They have a model homeless outreach team program in their city that does a lot of these same things. And then Wichita. Wichita has a homeless outreach team based very closely on the model that Colorado Springs is using. One thing that is significant about all of those cities is they all have anti-camping ordinances. They have somewhere in their system an ordinance that prohibits people from sleeping in public. But what they do in combination with that is they go through these efforts with homeless outreach teams and documentation and the offering of services to save the enforcement for a last resort. Basically making that distinction between the ability to comply and the willingness to comply. So, really comes down to three things. What would a HOT team do? Educate, encourage, and enforce. That's what they would be doing. Educating the person on what resources are available. I don't know if you picked up the material in the back or not, but there was a resource guide. That's actually from Wichita. That's their homeless outreach team put that together. And it's just a brochure that can be given to the person that identifies all of the services in the community that are available to them for whatever their need is. We can put something like that together here in Topeka, have that, so when we have that officer going out into the field, this would be something that they could give to the person on where they can get some assistance. The officer would then be encouraging the person. It says outreach and diversion, but what the officer would be doing would be giving the person the brochure, letting them know what our ordinance says about camping in public, and then encouraging them to accept these services. And if they do, then they are diverted and they go and utilize those services, and they're not entering the criminal justice system. There would be no arrest or citation, and hopefully they go on their way and their situation improves. It's only when you get to the enforcement, when you've done those things, then you've switched from the ability to comply. Now we're talking about willingness to comply. If they've refused those, then the third thing is the enforcement. And that's when the officer then could potentially make the arrest and impound the property. And the camping ordinance is what that is for. So I guess just to close here, I wanted to give you this information because it's not just the camping ordinance that's at issue here. It's a larger, more big picture structure that you need all of these things to make this work. You have any questions?
If I understood correctly, the camping ordinance would be the first thing, or is the other the first thing? Which comes first?
Well, we've already started working on a homeless outreach team.
Okay.
I've spoken with Chief Cochran about this, and he's supportive. That's why Sergeant Clam is here. Him and I have been working on this. We've already had some preliminary meetings that we've set up. We've met with Vallejo to discuss this idea. I think next week we got a meeting with the shelter. And so we've already started working on that. It's not really which comes first. We're working on all of it.
Well, I mean, I guess can we go ahead and vote this in without the other being done, or do we have to wait?
You could, but the other, if you voted
But
it
you can't
in
really.
today, it's not ready to go yet, so we
Okay.
can't enforce it. Because
And
we
it-
need the documented efforts and the outreach under the Pottinger Protocols.
And I guess if that was the rights of the homeless, are there any rights to the businesses? The right to not have people sleep on their doorstep?
But you do. You have the traditional property rights. You know, as a property owner, you can tell somebody to get off your property. Largely what we're going to be dealing with here is situations where it's public property.
Public. And we have a homeless task force already,
We
correct?
do. We do.
And we've had them for years, correct?
Yes.
What have they done? Huh? I mean, yeah, for camping, illegal camping, have you done?
Please, please. I know I was a part of that task force, and Corey can tell you more about it, but I know one of the things that you guys did is we do have a dedicated officer, right? And then a dedicated gentleman from the mission, or a couple, you might talk about that if I see a homeless person, I let them know and they go try to get them, but, am I right, correct?
Yes, we have several outreach teams already that are involved in the community. We have always had some outreach teams involved. With regards to the campsites, I think what Luther talked about in regards to criminalization is something that would be a nice discussion to have at our next homeless task force meeting, because we were unfamiliar with what was happening here. So we haven't had a chance to have a recent conversation about that. So I would love to have the opportunity to put that on the agenda at a homeless task force meeting so we could come back with you, maybe the chair and a few others come back and present what the homeless task force sees as an option or not.
I would suggest that you do that, Corey.
Okay.
Because this isn't going to be an overnight process, as you can see. And I did used to attend that because of my job, that task force, and there's 34, 35 members. I mean,
Okay.
I was shocked at how many people were at the table, like Vallejo. Can you just off the top of your head talk about?
It's increased since you've left. We probably have about 40 people at the table. We have communities and schools, Vallejo, Salvation Army, Let's Help, Doorstep, Breakthrough House, just a whole list of people attending, and all for the sole purpose of trying to help with homelessness in Topeka.
And I know that DCF was involved, and I know that, I'm trying to think of, RADAC was involved.
Community action.
Community action, but RADAC is a part of DCF, or the state of Kansas. And then there was another service, and I can't think of it, but they specialize in alcohol and alcohol and drug abuse. They were there at the table. They do have a great presentation every month from everybody that's there and what they bring to the table. It was very, very, very interesting. I think this is something that we would have to work with you. Salvation Army was there. The mission was there. I mean, there was probably a good 30 entities there.
So that would be a good start
Oh, yeah.
for,
We actually had a document very similar to that several years back, the outreach document from Wichita that was provided. I just got that today by email, so I haven't been able to locate the one that we had in Topeka several years ago. Of course, it would need to be updated, but that's something definitely that can be put together. Of course, we have 2 pages of food pantries in Topeka, so it'd be hard to get it on one document like that with the resources. Of course, we only have 1 shelter, and so that will save some room there. But yeah, it's something that we'd be interested in participating with whoever in creating that document.
Absolutely.
But
Great.
we would love the opportunity to voice in on from the homeless task force.
And we would love that. We
Okay.
would love to have you. We would, couldn't do it without you guys, really, because that's a big part of what you're doing, just a kind of a secret part that needs to be out in the open. Do you have anything else to add, Corey?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I have one more question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But you've never talked about the homeless and camping, or have you just, what has your thoughts or discussion been on that?
Well, I don't want to speak for everybody in the homeless task force, but I think that our goal is to get people into shelter no matter what. Some people can't go to the shelter, and so I'm not for sure how this ordinance would affect those people that, well, there's a shelter bed available, but they can't go to the mission
Because
for various reasons. Sometimes it's behavior, sometimes it's medical reasons, I'm sure. Yeah, alcohol, drug use can't be done at the shelter, so.
But do we have to, Luther, send them someplace here, or can we send them to like a shelter in Lawrence, or does it have to be within this community for the bed, say?
I does think it does have to be in this community, because I think it would be a problem if we were transporting people to other cities and putting them in their shelter.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the only thing that I seen that we were doing, like I said, when we seen homeless, we would let that special team that we have, I can't think of his name, the 2-3 people that would go out and check on them. They would offer them food, they would offer them services. So they were kind of already kind of doing that. But a lot of times they won't take the service. They might take the
Right,
food,
right.
and then they would follow up the next day and go back. I forgot the officer's name. And the one guy from Salvation Army, and then one from the mission. But they were whenever you had something, you could report it to them, and they would go out and check on them and offer those services. You can sit down, Corey, if you don't. Is there any more questions for Corey?
No.
Mike, no? Okay. The one concern that I have is you can't stay at the mission if you're drinking or drugging. And I know there was a gentleman that used to come to the council members that talked about David that got killed under there, and that's how I was brought aware of it. And he's like, it's an underground, it's all this, and it is. It's a different light over there. And they ended up killing him because he was trying to get people to reunite with their families. But then we learned that there's the mission is always open. But when we went down there one time, me and Councilwoman Lana Kennedy and a couple other people, we went down there. We were looking for David when he became missing, and we ran into some people and tried to talk to them. They don't want to leave. They want to stay right there. They want to drink. They want to drug. If they have children, that's where DCF comes in. We can call them because, on that, when they're doing that, because they're putting the children at risk. But other than that, there's really no other leverage that we can take. And, we talk to them and they're perfectly happy. They go over to the mission, they eat, and they're out of there. And I think that's why they set up camp right next to the mission, so they're right there, So that was one of my questions. How many people are under the bridge right now? It looks like it's increased over the years.
I don't know.
Sure. did you want to say, Corey? Sure. Sorry. Because it looks like it's increased immensely.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. I did forget one thing. Just recently, the Homeless Task Force has implemented a coordinated assessment in which we are working through our client track system, which is our database where we calculate who's getting resources in the community, et cetera. So we're doing a coordinated assessment on individuals and then taking it back to a team and kind of doing wraparound services with that. So this is something that we could do with the outreach team and have more people working. We just had one the other day, a gentleman leaving the hospital, had no place to go, and we were able to coordinate a bunch of different resources for that particular person's needs. So it's another way that we can keep people from camping, but I think we need to look at all those resources before making a big decision like
Right,
this.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you know how many people are under the bridge?
I believe Luther's numbers were from the point in time count this year, and he is right. We had about 60 in the count, but there's probably maybe a few more that we weren't able to count that particular day. It's always hard counting.
60 people under there. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay. And then how many nights do we have to, you talked about implementing something. So if we found a homeless person and that we had to, offer them a night, like in a facility, how many nights do we have to do that? Because, okay, so I'm going to comply tonight, but then I'm going to go back out there tomorrow. Then we're going to find him tomorrow. Then, I'm going to comply again. I mean, because some of them are just mentally ill and they want to be there, And so how many nights do we have to continue this?
Well, I don't know that there's any one number I can give you because it's done a little differently in different cities. But typically what they do is there is they will have a number of beds that are available for individuals such as that may be intoxicated or have substance abuse issues or something like that. And they're limited on how long they can stay there. Maybe it's 2 days or 3 days or whatever, and then at the end of that, they either have to leave or enter into acceptance of some of these services.
But what I'm saying, Luther, is, okay, we've talked to this gentleman, he's accepted to go to a facility, okay? A facility that we have, but then the next day, he's right back out there. And so he's agreed again, we've taken him again, and he's agreed again, that's day 2. And then the next day, he's right back out there. I mean, how long does this yo-yo keep going before,
Well, you may have an individual that does yo-yo back and forth like that, but what they're not going to be able to do is to establish a camp, because at that point, the outreach efforts would have been documented, and if they persist on staying there, they would then be subject to the enforcement and arrest.
Okay. The next thing was, how long do we have to hold their possessions?
They have 90 days to claim it from the time it's impounded.
Where will we hold that at?
Well, that's actually something I looked at quite a bit with some of these cities I've looked at, and how they do it is they will put the possessions in large storage containers and keep them in their impound lot, because some of this property you're not going to want in
Absolutely.
your property and evidence room because of health issues. So they put it in storage containers and they keep it in the impound lot and tag it with the person's information, and they claim it there. It may be in a building or something. I mean, it's not outside, it's protected.
Okay, I'd like to hear from the mission, if you would like to speak on this today. If not, that's fine. I'm just going to go down the row. If nobody else has, do you have any questions?
I will.
Okay.
I want to hear.
Okay, all right.
Barry just apologized that he couldn't be here today. He's actually receiving a recognition for the rescue mission from the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions today out of town, but he apologizes he couldn't be here. I just wanted to clarify that number of 68 people being quote-unquote on the river. I don't think that's a realistic number. A number of years ago, the police department, I believe it is, actually cleared those camps out off the river. You are seeing those numbers increase again, but that number of 68 people is all over the city. Some of them in cars and just all over. But to say those are on the river is not realistic. The second picture, the other comment I was going to make, second picture he showed there was actual in front of the Topeka Rescue Mission. That gentleman was a disgruntled past guest of the rescue mission. You've seen, I think, 3 or 4 tents. At one time, he had 6 tents set up. He wasn't sleeping in any of them. It was just a protest against the mission. We fought for months and months to try to get it removed. The camps just kept getting bigger and more trash and more garbage. And really, the city's hands were tied. They couldn't do anything. We finally had to go to court, got a permanent injunction against him a couple months ago, and police department, thanks to Sergeant Clam, they come and moved all of his stuff, and the fly-off wall is clear now. So we understand the camping ordinance is a very difficult. We have personally struggled with it there at the rescue mission. So I'd be willing to try to answer any questions.
Are there any questions?
How many beds, like Luther said, we had to have, beds available. If this person is allowed in, how many beds do you usually have?
We have never, in all the years the rescue mission has been there, turned somebody away because we was full. We accommodate them, cots on the floor, mats on the floor. We find a place for them. We are operating outside of our coded number of beds through a permission of the city to sleep those people on cots and beds. That's an ongoing variance that we get from the city, but we have never turned anybody away because we were full.
And there's no mandatory religious or therapeutic programming?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by therapeutic. There is no requirement for religion.
Okay.
We do provide a chapel service, but it's not required they attend. During the chapel time, they do have to observe quiet time, which means they can't play games, can't watch TV, but they don't have to go to the chapel service.
So what is therapeutic programming, like counseling or?
I think it was what they're referring to, that came from that Pottinger case. And I think that what they were talking to about was like drug and alcohol count, like a group therapy or something like that.
Is that mandatory? Do you have anything like that?
We do have guests at time that have shown a history of struggling with those things, and we could possibly make it a condition of their stay at the rescue mission that they get alcohol, drug treatment, mental health assistance, but it's typically somebody that has had a history with us and repeatedly abused it or something.
Because this says
So it's not the typical requirement, I'm sorry.
Okay, because they're saying you can't do this if we use. So I just want to make sure we had something.
You can't make it a condition of accepting the bed.
Right.
That they
we
go
can't
through.
make it. They
That's
can
what that
go-
case is saying, is that you can't condition them getting the bed, that they have to go through religious or therapeutic programming. That can't be a condition on your bed.
So the rescue mission can't say, yeah, you can have a bed if you do this or this.
Right. It's fine to offer it, you just can't make it mandatory.
Okay. And so you
And
don't.
typically, that requirement would be you can sleep here tonight, but within 2 weeks, you need to be getting some kind of treatment or something. And again, I stress, it's based upon their negative history and abuse of that in staying with us in the past. Somebody coming cold off the streets wouldn't have that requirement on them.
If you have someone that has behavioral issues that you have turned away before, when's the time up that they can then come back and say, I've changed? I mean, or are they banned indefinitely?
We have they're called premise bars, and a premise bar can range the gamut from having smoking on the premises. We consider pornography on the premises a premise bar. It can be fighting. So to give you a clear answer, I can't do that. It depends on the seriousness of the event. If it's because they had pornography, Typically, they'd have to meet with a case management team the next day, and they could get back in. If it's because they're fighting, pulled a knife on somebody, it could be indefinite. It is very limited number of people that we say you can't have services. And this particular gentleman that was on the wall, he's the first person that we've ever said, ever in the 60-plus years of the mission, you will never get services at the rescue mission again.
Wow.
It's only happened with one guy.
Well, good to know. Okay.
Is the rescue mission willing to be a bedside for us if this is what we are looks like this is the way that we want to move? Would they be willing to do that, or is that something we need to talk to Barry about?
I'm sure it would have to be clarified by Barry, but I think he would wholeheartedly agree to cooperate with whatever efforts you have. I don't know if it's this particular ordinance or if it's the other ordinance about, you don't call it panhandling, but that's what the ordinance is. But it uses the term private, a public shelter. And I've heard Barry say, I'm just cautioning to using that term. Our shelter is not a public shelter. So might need to be careful with that term. I don't know if it's this ordinance or the other one.
Okay, we appreciate that. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
I just have a couple questions for Luther to go back on a couple of things that earlier you mentioned. We're talking about right-of-ways and public property right now, and something was mentioned earlier about businesses, because we have had comments from businesses, and I think what I most remember is along Wanamaker, and that toward the north end of that Wanamaker corridor towards the interstate, where apparently to the west of there are areas where camping has taken place, and some of the businesses, they go to open up, and there are people there that are in the doorways or on the business. Those things are handled by, what, a criminal trespass ordinance, as opposed to something like this?
They are if we can find the owner, and that's the difficulty we run into is a lot of this commercial property. We can't find an owner to be a complaining party for a trespassing case. So the way we address that in the camping ordinance is if they're on private property, then they need written permission of the property owner.
Okay. And that was another thing. It was brought up at a NIA meeting that residents have seen camping taking place on property that doesn't have a building on it or a home on it, just an open field, but it is privately owned property, and therefore law enforcement couldn't take any action in that case either, because it was privately owned property they had given permission to that person to camp, but I don't know that they were able to determine who that person was to see the written permission.
Yeah. The way it is right now, I mean, if it's private property, the law enforcement's not going to be able to do anything unless they've actually got a property owner or manager or somebody coming forward making the complaint. So this changes that, making it simplified, where they need to produce documentation showing that they have the permission to be there.
Okay, so in that case, they see a camp on an open field. They approach, they ask for the written permission, document, they're unable to provide it. Are they then subject to arrest or and enforcement? And what if they can say, okay, but in a month now, I can show up with the written permission, I just couldn't get a hold of the owner at the time? Would that be something that I guess would a judge would take in consideration when hearing the case?
We've got to follow this process. If they're on private property, we're still going to have to follow these protocols and to engage them in the outreach and offer them the services and the beds and try to encourage them to leave there.
Okay.
If they refuse that, then they could be subject to arrest.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Yes.
Can I ask a question? In fact, I have a couple. You were talking about the travel, that this came under the fundamental right to travel. But travel means to go a long way or go abroad. But they consider traveling they considered traveling by the homeless to go from this sidewalk to this sidewalk?
Well, what they're talking about there is a constitutional concept of the right to travel, and they're essentially talking about just the right to be left alone and go where you want to. And some cities, back when those protocols were being developed, had policies and practices where they would literally drive homeless people out of their community by doing different things to keep them from being there. And that's how the right to travel argument came into that, because the government was doing something that stopped the ability of the person to go where they wanted to.
Okay, and then I have something for Lisa. Okay, this ordinance, I know there was questions about, and I found it in here that it wouldn't affect it, but there's some questions about the Boy Scouts camping, there was questions about somebody just camping on the river. Okay, are we as a council supposed to fill all those holes and tell you how, if this happens, how to do that? If this happens, or does this, I thought this covered that.
I think it could, but one of the things that was brought up, and I think it was brought up again maybe Tuesday evening, Councilmember Hiller said that she talked with someone associated with the river, I don't know what agency the person was with, that they said they were going to start issuing permits for folks who wanted to camp along there. I think perhaps just reaching out to them and coordinating in some way, what are you guys planning to do, and maybe making some reference that these folks need to be in compliance with whatever permitting requirements are placed upon them by any particular agency.
But that's something we would say, okay, reach out to these people and add that in. We
Right.
don't.
The other option would be that we would do it. I think that was the initial, I guess, ask or query, is whether or not we needed to set up some type of permitting process as the city. But if what I heard correctly the other evening is true, it would be ideal if this other agency would do that, and we could just reference, okay, you need to show the officer that you have a permit from XYZ agency to be here.
And does all that need to be in this before we vote on this?
I think probably a reference to it, right? Unless, Luther, you have a different opinion on
Well,
it.
I was just going to say that if you look at the city of Wichita's camping ordinance, they actually say that in their ordinance, that camping is unlawful unless, or except if you have a permit issued by the city manager's office.
Well, I think
Because
ours
it's what
says
they're
use
saying.
common sense or something.
It does, but there's a variety of ways you can handle that permitting issue.
Okay, thank you.
Are you done? Okay. Lisa, I would like to give you that task with the State River to see, and if you can get with Councilwoman Hiller, and come back to us at our next meeting to see where we're at on that. Because if they are going to issue permits, I think that would take care of that, correct?
Yeah, and it would be a lot easier on the
Absolutely.
city, I think.
But having said that, one of our homeless people could also go down there and get a permit. I mean, it's just the gray area, I'm sorry. Okay, Corey, do you have anything else you want to add? Okay, thank you, and I'm going to put you with the task of going back to the task force and coming to our next meeting, okay? And I'll try to sit down and see when we can do that. Sasha, you have anything to add? You sure? Okay. I know you got something to add, don't you? I always have things to say. Okay. And then with the, just a second, while this is on my mind. Also with the camping in the backyard, I know somebody was concerned about that. If they have to have permission by that owner, then we won't need to worry about that. Is that correct?
Right.
So I mean, if they don't live there and they're camping in the backyard, then the owner can say that. But if the owner's gone, they need it in writing, or they could come back to court and say, yeah, it was okay.
Right.
I don't think too many people are going to. It would be no different than the private property, right? And getting permission.
Yes.
Okay. Right.
I think, Councilmember Ortiz, I think that's where the common sense
Right.
language, I think that's the situation that was supposed to apply. If you've got, some kids camping in the neighbor's yard, you're not going to call the police and ask them to come down and cite these folks for camping,
But I can understand that because, I mean, whenever we do something, people think of everything. And I'm just saying, every little question will come out. And we had a resident at 10th and Golden, and somebody had set up tent in her backyard, and she's an elderly, and she didn't even know it. And they had been back there for like 2 or 3 weeks. Now, when she finally found out, and we called the police, they had to go. But I'm just saying, so, you know, you got to look at both sides of that. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. For those of you guys who don't know me, my name is Sergeant Clam. I supervise our behavioral health unit, so our CIT teams for the department. One of the tasks that Chief Cochran has given me recently is to create a homeless outreach team for the department. So that's one of the things that I've been working with Luther with. And so that will fall under the CIT umbrella within the department. So like for example, I talked about there, the training that officers need, specialized training on dealing with individuals with special circumstances. It's going to fall under the CIT umbrella already, so they'll already have that training. It'll be mandatory for whatever officer does our outreach. They'll be CIT certified and things of that nature. So I'm more than happy to field any questions you guys have from as far as how, at least I currently envision how we would run the homeless outreach team, if you have any of that. And then I also have 2 questions. So I'll take any if you guys have any first.
Just one. How long is this going to take for you to get this team up and running?
Realistically, my goal is the end of summer.
Wow.
That's my hopes. Luther and I had a meeting with Vallejo last week. They already have some homeless outreach teams, and since we already work with Vallejo in the CIT program, so currently the way my CIT program works is I have a CIT trained officer working with a mental health professional from Vallejo. So instead of reinventing the wheel, right now my vision was maybe instead of a mental health professional in the car with the police officer, it's one of their homeless outreach team members. We already have memos of understanding with Vallejo and things of that nature, so I thought that would help speed the process up. With that being said, I have a meeting scheduled with Barry next week, also with Sasha and Carrie next week. So we're still building this, but I hope August, September.
Wow.
You know, definitely before it starts getting cold again. I think we can have it up and running in the next couple months.
Good deal, because we need to report back in by September.
Yeah, the biggest question would be is how often we do it per month because of manpower issues. Like I think we can have the position up and running, but it would be an everyday thing, would be a couple of days a month. That's kind of what we're going to have to work on right now, again, just because of manpower.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Mr. Padilla?
Sergeant, thank you. I want to ask something that I know from experience from being at the PD, and I'm encouraged by the formation of the teams. How do you select the officers who are going to be on this team? Are there any, is there any vetting, for a better word, of the officers? Because you've got to really want to do this job, and you have to have a different mindset as opposed to arresting you for something else.
Absolutely. So for a position like this, we go what's called through a management council. And so basically you would have to, if you're interested, you'd write a memo and you would put all the information that makes you the most qualified officer in that memo. Every individual who put in a memo or put in for the position goes before the management council, which I think it's 5 lieutenants, a mixture of lieutenants and captains, something along those lines. They basically rank everybody, and then the chief picks from the top 3, if I remember right, from our contract. With that being said, when I write the job description, I will put in specific stuff like, for example, you have to be CIT certified. I think I'm actually going to in there like you have to be or willing to be ATV certified, so we can actually get out there and outreach people who are way out there in some heavily wooded areas. You know, I can kind of draft the description to make it to where the individuals have a very clear understanding that, you know, we might take enforcement action, but this is all about getting people help. This is about getting them services, things of that nature. And officers are kind of used to that now with behavioral health units and how, you know, because we've been going hard with that. They're kind of understanding what we do on a regular basis. And so I have a few people who are already interested just from the rumor mill that, hey, this is happening. We have had 1 or 2 officers actually volunteer on their free time over the years doing homeless outreach, depending on the hours and things of that nature. They're already interested. I've had conversations with them. So, but I can't guarantee it. But also being the supervisor, I can help direct them, whoever gets in that position.
Okay, thank you for your answer, because I think training is one thing, but then the proper selection for that job is important.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And you have 2 questions for us?
Yeah, so questions I would have just from the enforcement side or even the resources side is if we have an individual who is intoxicated, are they not eligible for enforcement? Because currently, rules of the mission is you cannot come to the mission if you're intoxicated. So does that mean there's not a bed available, so therefore we can't enforce any action? And then my second question is kind of similar, like the individual who was premise barred, or the mandatory ban, the guy who camped outside. So he is homeless, he still camps. I talked to him, I don't know, a week ago. So because he is not able to go to set foot on the property of the mission, is he not subject to this law? Can we not enforce on him because there's not a bed available because it's a private entity?
And I think that's going to be very important for us to rely on the task force and to rely on the private, to try to figure out some public-private sectors for those situations exactly. Because I don't know if the gentleman that's drinking, if he can go to Vallejo. No?
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
so the Vallejo, and I don't want to speak for
Right,
Vallejo,
right.
but just my experience, like they have a crisis house.
Right.
That is not for homelessness.
Right,
That is for people in mental health crisis. So if you're just homeless, and in this case, let's say, you've been drinking, but you're not like drunk, they're not going to accept you at their crisis house because you don't meet their qualifications.
Right. And I think that's our goal, is to try to figure out a private sector that we can do something to help these people, because I think it's the goal is to help and not to just, putting him in jail is not going to help. He's going to sober up, he's going to get back out, and we're going to have that road. So I was under the understanding we're going to try to help them, and I think that's where the task force comes in. So, and Corey, if you can go back and ask who would be willing, because I'm serious, there are so many entities there that maybe we're just missing something. I think Midland's there too, aren't they? Yeah. You would be surprised, just different entities that are doing different things. But if we can do that,
Okay.
or try to figure that out. But that's a good question, and that's one that concerns me, because I know the mission is open, but then they have criteria too that we have to meet, and we're going to have to figure that out.
Absolutely. And just from my experience, I think that'll be our biggest hurdle is going to be the alcoholism.
And drugs.
Yeah,
They can't go to detox?
well, again, I don't know all the criteria for detox, but I can tell you that they are almost always to capacity. And so
Yeah.
if is the individual willing to go to detox, that's one question, because oftentimes they're not.
But then that would be a refusal if detox had a bed and they are willing, right?
If they had a bed, yes.
Yeah, but again, I don't want to speak for them, because like I said, I don't know their criteria to get into detox. I know you can't just walk
Well,
up
I
and say,
worked there for
want
about 10 years, and it used to be, back in the day, but that you could, but you'd have to want to. It's not going to be a revolving door.
Right.
So they would have to, like
And
you
I
say, want
think-
to.
I think that's where it comes in, that we call the police and say, we make good notes to say we've helped them this time. You know what I'm saying? I think that's where that comes
Right.
in at.
Thank you, yes.
So do we answer both of your questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. And we look forward to you getting back to us, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Mr. Lesser, you're on board. Councilman Lesser, I apologize.
That's all right. I have probably more questions that now have come to light from the discussion. One question that I have is, I think was just answered in regards to, I do know from assisting other individuals in regards to substance abuse. Vallejo, for instance, if you want to take someone there for detox, whatever, what have you, they do have to be willing. They can't make them, and as a matter of fact, they can leave anytime they want to, which then kind of creates another problem. I completely agree with Councilwoman Ortiz in regards to, the answer isn't putting them in jail and throwing them in there. The other question I do have in regards to that is in instances where people are under the influence or intoxicated, at least for that period of time, the short term, we do have the ability, correct, to issue them a citation or arrest them for public intoxication, those type of circumstances, do we not?
No, not unless they're in the roadway.
Not unless they're in the roadway, okay.
No, like if they're on public property in their camp drunk,
What?
They did away with that some years ago.
yeah. If they're in the roadway, but if they're just drunk on their indoor camp, there's no citation.
Walking down the street, or I mean, I say street, but like downtown, on the sidewalks. No problem? Huh, didn't know?
Why did you? Oh, sorry.
You're right.
Okay.
I think those laws went away several years ago.
They did.
Why?
Public intoxication, rescinded them.
Okay, that's, like I said, that was a question I had. The other question that I have is, I guess for Lisa as well as for Luther, is in regards to the private property. And I'm asking for a little bit of an explanation of what the doctrine is in regards to if someone obviously is on property, it's either public or it's private. If it's public, obviously we know where the public property is. So if it is private, are you telling me that there's a doctrine in that says that it's our burden to show that they shouldn't be there versus their burden to show that they have permission?
I think what I was saying is that it's not the police. The property doesn't belong to the police officers. They don't have the authority under normal circumstances to tell people they have to leave that property. What this would do, though, is put the obligation on the person doing the camping to show that they have permission to be there. It works similar to the trespassing requirement.
Right, and that's kind of what I'm getting at right now is, as of right now, you're saying if the police get a call to go to the field Padilla was talking about behind Jimmy John's or what have you,
Sure.
and they don't have, it's obviously private property, but you're saying that they can't remove the people, tell them they need to leave if the person says, I can be here. That's I guess what my question is.
Right, because the police officer at that point doesn't have any way of knowing whether the person has permission or not to be on the property.
So that's where my question is: the burden becomes our burden to
It
show
is
that
now.
they don't belong there.
Right.
So my question then would be where I don't understand that to a certain extent is if I'm at my house and I look across the street and I see somebody sitting and laying in my neighbor's yard, and my neighbor's out of town for 2 weeks, whatever, and I call the police and say, hey, can you come check this out? There's somebody over here. Well, I'm not the owner of the property. I don't know who this guy is. Why in that situation, how is that situation any different?
Well, the police could check it out as a suspicious person. I mean, maybe they're a burglar or they're a thief or whatever, but when it comes to whether the officer can order the person to leave the property, it's not the officer's place to give that order.
Mr. Lester, I have a field that's a half a block next door. People come up there and camp, and I have to go try to hunt down the property owner. She lives over there. She works odd hours, and sometimes she's like, don't worry about it. I do worry about it because they're homeless. They're living over
Right.
there. They're using my water. They're watching me, so I don't know what they'll do. But to try to get her to move on that, and there's nothing I can do. The officers come out, they talk to them. Sometimes they'll leave, sometimes they won't. It is. It's a battle that's an ongoing battle when the owners won't step up to the plate.
That's all I had. Just some clarifications, trying to understand that there again, I don't know that I completely still understand. It appears that it's our burden to show you don't belong there versus their burden to show that they have a right to be there.
Essentially what it comes down to is for the crime of trespassing, it requires the complaint of the person with authority over the property. And that's how we get to
And I get that, and I'm not necessarily saying in that. I'm saying for our guys to go say, get out of here. You don't belong here. This isn't. You need to go.
What if they say no? Then we get into a situation where the officer is going to either accept that or make an arrest, and the officer's then in the position of arresting somebody for something that they didn't have authority to back up.
Well, then it could. I mean, regardless. I'm not an officer, but I mean, I've seen it all the time, you know, then it's not following a legal order to go. Whether they have a right or not, we can fight that battle later on. So it's kind of what my position is, but if, you know.
We
that-
used to be able to do that years ago.
You just can't
There was vagrancy laws.
And I'm not
That
arguing,
may be
I'm just trying to
what you're
understand,
referring
I'm
to,
just
the-
trying to understand how
The vagrancy and the loitering and public intoxication.
Sure.
Most of those laws were repealed because they were unconstitutional.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Sure.
When you figure it out, let me know, because I have that same problem. City manager. Oh, okay. Can you come to the mic, please? I should have made you the last time, I'm sorry. Just so our people can hear you.
Well, and if it would help, I have an example, exactly what you're talking about. There's a homeless individual that I've been outreaching since last December. Quasi-interested in services. He's a very difficult case. He lives in a very small patch of woods behind Huntington and Gage, like the Skinny's Bar, that general area. So kind of what you're talking about, there was an individual that lived in the general neighborhood who, she was from the Philippines and she goes to the Philippines every winter. I would find him every single day on their front porch. Hey, what are you doing? I would talk to him, I'd outreach him every single time. Hey, they give me permission to be here. There's zero way for me to find out yes or no because they're out of the country. He wasn't destroying anything. I think he was just staying out of the wind because it was kind of an enclosed porch. But there's nothing we could do. We didn't have a complainant as far as forcing him to move. I suggested to him. For me, like he told me, no, he's pretty comfortable there. He would spend 18 hours a day on their porch, things of that nature. But there's just nothing we could do. I still outreach him on a regular basis, and we're trying to get him hooked up with different insurances so he can hopefully get his own place. But that's just one of the difficulties, kind of exactly what you're talking about. So.
Thank you.
Thanks.
City manager? And then followed by Mr. Dunlap, if you have something to say.
My only comment's very simple. I like the process that you're using, being very deliberate, looking at what we put forward for an ordinance, seeing where it might need to be adjusted and moving forward, involving all the players here. I'm excited to see where this evolves to, and I'm just enjoying the process. It's going to be a good one. I think this is definitely a situation that we need to deal with. We have individual owners, your situations. We need to make people feel comfortable in their community, but also try to assist those that need additional help, and we're taking their rights into consideration. So I think the process is in good shape. Thank you.
And I agree. I think we need to remember we got to be, this is very touchy, and we need to be compassionate so that others will see that. Mr. Dunlap, thank you for joining us today.
I want to compliment Luther for doing a good presentation. I enjoyed that. I think we should look at maybe having a competitive organization for the rescue mission. I think the turnaround people, is there a difference between public intoxication and being at 0.08, which is the DWI level? I think there is. I think they turn around people at 0.8, don't you? Okay, legally drunk, this DUI. Is that the same as being public intoxication when you're falling down, stuff like this? No, it's not. If I talk to some people down there, if they're not back by 7 p.m., that's the curfew. They're locked out. They can't ask for special permission, but they've got to do that ahead of time. If we pick up somebody 10 o'clock at night, are they going to be let in at that time? I don't know. If we have people down there, groups, Muslims, Wicca, are they going to be able to have their own services during the quiet time? Religion is not required. It is heavily stressed to go to services down there. If we're going to do that, I think we should look at having an alternative organization accepting federal funds to put these people who are not going to be compliant with the alcohol, with the music, with things like this. Federal funds are out there and available. Second thing, the officer brought up the fact of, well, how do we know whether they've got permission or not to film in the Philippines? We do have something currently for graffiti. When a house is spray it on, you can go down to code, fill out this one form, I did not want this thing on there, things like this. So instead of sending a certified letter, things like this, there's on it, you just sign once a year thing, and they'll come out and have a team just paint all over it, because they know it doesn't belong there. Can we have the same similar thing with people camping in houses that don't belong there or in the backyards? I think we can. The woman in the Philippines, give it to dispatch, have something, no one is allowed on my property except me. And then if they find somebody else, call dispatch, see if such a thing ends up. And if it's not there, or if it's there saying no one's allowed, hey, you can arrest them. Now, true, you have to have an incident first, one time, of question whether this person belongs there or not. Get a hold of the owner, and then find out. The trouble I have with having the individuals prove they have it, you know what? There's a lot of forgery over there. There is. Who's to say somebody just didn't get it there the day before and write down the person's name and they have permission to stay there? Is there any way of verifying that information? Very, very difficult. We got a long way to go on this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've put a pretty good dent in it today. Corey, you guys meet on the second Wednesday. So the next task force at 1 o'clock still? Okay. The 11th, July 11th? Okay. So we can't have a meeting until after that, July the 11th. And I'll shoot everybody some dates if that's okay. All right. Is that okay, Corey? Okay. Is there anything else?
I have one just quick question.
Sure. No.
To the officer. How many times do you find people on like on the porches or in the backyards? Or is it mainly that big field where somebody owns it and we don't know who owns it and how to get hold of it?
The answer is yes. We find a lot of squatters in abandoned houses. There's a lot of abandoned houses in Topeka.
But is that city property then, or is that?
That's private property at that
Okay.
point. Typically, in my experience, the homeowner has no idea that they're in there. In North Topeka, there is a lot on public property, like back in the woods and things of that
Right.
nature. Also off of Wanamaker, people just don't know, but like behind the Nards,
Yeah.
there's some large camps back there as well. So it really is all over, both in private and public land.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
And at the parks. Yes.
I would just to broaden it a little bit, there is at least one individual over in High Crest that owns his own property, living on it.
Yep.
That property.
Yep.
We're aware of that. That's a, oh, is he gone?
Oh, really?
Okay. Yeah, that's another thing I don't know, some committee needs to look at that as well, yeah. Is there anything else? Does anybody else have anything? Lisa? Nope. Mike?
No, thank you, Luther.
Yeah, Luther, great presentation. Brenda? Okay. The only other thing that I would say before adjournment is, 2 weeks ago, I had some goats in my yard, in my neighborhood. And so we're gonna have to pull that ordinance again and look at it. So that will come, I want to deal with this first before we deal with that, but I do want to say that they were some big goats, and I called the city manager who was at a Royals game. I can appreciate that. And he said, I can't really hear you, but okay. And I said, well, I'll text you. And I did, and then he texted me back and said, oh, shoot, I thought you said vicious dogs or dog. And when I sent him the picture, he was very, very shocked. It took me, I was off Friday that day. I didn't get anything done because I actually heard something on my back patio and went out there, and here these goats are. And they were going from neighbor to neighbor's house. We did call the police, and they came and said they can't do anything because they're domestic. But they would try to see how they could help me. So by the time they got out there, it was dark, and we looked around. We couldn't find them, only to find that they were in my neighbor's yard, who woke me up the next morning because they had kicked her door and messed up everything on her patio. So again, I called the city manager and asked him what we could do. And so I asked him what we could do, and then I said we didn't catch him last night, and he thought it was over. So by this time, all my neighbors is calling me. To make a long story short, I got on the phone with Commissioner Cook because, as we know in the ordinance, they have a vet on call. We called the sheriff, who in turn, we were waiting for our animal control, who said, no, we don't pick them up. So then we got the sheriff involved, and then the sheriff said, okay, we'll wait, he came out, and he was trying to watch them, and then the vet came out, and then they left. I don't know what happened, so then we had to start all over again. Well, then I called the city manager back, who in turn I called Kevin Cook, who called the sheriff, Sheriff Jones, and at the end of the day, I had 6 officers chasing these 3 goats around my neighborhood, and the county came, and they had 2 or 3 sheriffs, but they did, because Kevin goes, this is a story you cannot make up, Sylvia. And when I forwarded him the pictures, they were just saying how they finally caught him, and then they took him to the vet, blah, 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 blah. But it took us almost all weekend to catch them and to figure out what we were going to do with them. I did learn in there that when the officer drove up, he said, we don't do domestic animals, and they're not vicious, so we don't have to remove them. I said, well, if you go up to him, I bet you he'll be vicious, you know. But they also said that with the dog. If they show up and there's a friendly dog that doesn't belong to me, on my porch, they can't remove it because it's not vicious. So that's something else I want to look at in that ordinance. Because I know we spend a lot of time on that. And if that's true and they don't know who the owner is, we need to relook at that. So we need to look at the goats, and we need to look at the dogs.
The friendly dogs.
Friendly dogs.
Hey, council member.
Yes.
I was involved in that a little bit.
Oh, you were? I didn't see you chasing them.
I wasn't out there. Animal control asked me about it, and just from what I know about the situation, I think part of the confusion was because the goats were considered livestock, the responsibility for that is on the county animal control. They have state statutes that deal with that, and their animal control officers, the county sheriff's department, has a contract with a vet to provide boarding for those animals until they're claimed or either sold at an auction barn.
Right.
We don't have that mechanism in place under the city structure.
Right.
So I think that's where the breakdown is we needed county animal control to deal with that.
Okay. Well, he came and he left.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was crazy, but I did have the officer said, even in the ordinance, if it's a friendly dog that's on my porch, they don't have to remove it. But it's not my dog, and it's a big dog. So I just want us to relook at it. And then, so if it's clear with the goats, we just need to know, I have my whole neighbors from 3 blocks, everybody calling. So I give kudos to the city manager for hanging in there with me. And he said, please tell me when this is done. And I give kudos to the officers who actually chased and roped them down because they had a workout. And I think those new showers at the police department were very appreciated. So anyway, with no further ado, I'm going to adjourn this meeting. Thank you. Yeah, tomorrow. I'm busy tomorrow. Hey, I had a